What if everything you believed about the royal family was a carefully constructed lie? What if hidden within the ancient walls of Balmoral Castle lay a document so explosive that it could rewrite centuries of British history and challenge the very foundation of the monarchy itself? In the Scottish Highlands, where secrets whisper through stone corridors and shadows hold truths too dangerous to speak aloud, one loyal guard's routine patrol would uncover something that powerful people had killed to keep buried. A discovery that would force him to choose between his sworn oath of loyalty and the crushing weight of an earth-shattering truth. Some secrets are worth dying for. Others are worth living to expose. But when the very crown of England hangs in the balance, the line between hero and traitor becomes dangerously thin. This is the story of James MacLeod, a man whose devotion to duty would lead him down a path that would shake the monarchy to its core and forever change the course of British history. James MacLeod had walked these same corridors for 12 years, his footsteps echoing softly against the ancient stone floors of Balmoral Castle. The Scottish Highlands estate had become more than just his workplace. It was his sanctuary, a place where tradition and duty merged into something sacred. At 41, James carried himself with the quiet dignity that came from years of loyal service, his weathered face bearing the marks of a man who took his responsibilities seriously. The autumn of 2023 had painted the Cairngorms in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and the castle felt particularly peaceful during this off-season period. The royal family had departed weeks ago, leaving behind only the essential staff and security personnel. James preferred these quieter months, when he could perform his duties without the constant buzz of royal visits and state functions. It gave him time to truly appreciate the majesty of the estate and reflect on the weight of history contained within these walls. On that fateful Tuesday morning in October, James began his routine patrol at 5:30, just as the first pale light crept over the Highland peaks. The castle seemed to breathe in the early morning stillness, its towers and turrets silhouetted against the awakening sky. He moved through the familiar route with practiced ease, checking locks, testing security systems, and ensuring that every corner of the vast estate remained secure. The library wing had always been his favorite section to patrol. The smell of ancient leather bindings and aged paper created an atmosphere of scholarly reverence that appealed to his love of history. James had always been fascinated by the stories these walls could tell, the countless conversations and decisions that had shaped the nation from within these very rooms. He often imagined the great figures of British history walking these same paths, their presence still lingering in the shadows. As he rounded the corner into the main library hall, something immediately struck him as odd. A section of the oak-paneled wall near the far window appeared slightly askew, as if one of the panels had shifted during the night. James frowned, his trained eye catching details that others might miss. In his years of service, he had developed an almost supernatural awareness of his surroundings, an ability to notice even the smallest changes in the environment he protected. He approached the wall carefully, running his weathered hands along the carved wood. The panel felt loose under his touch, moving slightly when he applied gentle pressure. This was highly unusual. The library had been meticulously maintained, and every element of its construction was solid and secure. James knew the building's every quirk and characteristic, and this was definitely not normal. After a moment's hesitation, he decided to investigate further. The panel seemed to be held in place by some kind of hidden mechanism, and, with careful manipulation, he managed to slide it aside. Behind the wooden facade lay a narrow cavity in the stone wall, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. The space beyond disappeared into darkness, and a cool draft whispered from within, carrying with it the musty scent of long undisturbed air. James retrieved a flashlight from his utility belt and peered into the opening. The beam of light revealed what appeared to be a hidden passageway, its walls lined with the same ancient stone as the rest of the castle. His heart began to race with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. In all his years at Balmoral, he had never encountered anything like this. The castle was full of historical secrets, but this appeared to be something that had been deliberately concealed. Protocol dictated that he should report this discovery immediately to his supervisors, but something held him back. Perhaps it was curiosity, Or maybe it was the historian in him that couldn't resist the allure of uncovering a genuine mystery. Whatever the reason, James found himself squeezing through the opening and into the hidden passage. The corridor beyond was narrow and low, forcing him to duck as he moved forward. The walls were rough-hewn stone, clearly much older than the renovated sections of the castle that guests usually saw. His flashlight beam danced across spider webs and accumulated dust, evidence that this space had been undisturbed for many years, possibly decades. After 20 feet, the passage opened into a small chamber, roughly circular and perhaps 8 feet in diameter. The room was empty except for an ornate wooden chest sitting against the far wall. The chest appeared to be from a much earlier period than the Victorian renovations that characterized most of Balmoral's current appearance. Its dark wood was carved with intricate Celtic patterns, and heavy iron hinges suggested it had been built to last centuries. James approached the chest with mounting anticipation. The lock that had once secured it had long since corroded away, leaving only rusted remnants. He lifted the heavy lid with some effort, the hinges protesting with a groan that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. Inside, wrapped in what had once been fine silk but was now faded and brittle with age, lay several documents. The topmost document immediately caught his attention. It was written on heavy parchment in an elegant hand, the ink faded but still legible. The header made his breath catch in his throat. The last will and testament of His Royal Highness Prince Albert Victor Christian Edward, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, written in his own hand this day, December 1891. James stared at the document in disbelief. Prince Albert Victor, the eldest son of the future King Edward VII, had died officially in January 1892 of pneumonia during the influenza pandemic. He had been next in line to the throne before his death, which had changed the entire line of succession and ultimately led to his younger brother George becoming King George V. But here was a document claiming to be Prince Albert Victor's will, dated just weeks before his supposed death. James's hands trembled slightly as he held the parchment, aware that he might be holding a piece of history that could rewrite what everyone knew about the royal succession. He began to read the document carefully, his trained eye examining both the content and the physical characteristics of the parchment. The handwriting appeared consistent throughout, suggesting it was indeed written by a single person. The language was formal but personal, characteristic of private documents from that era. What he read made his blood run cold. According to this will, Prince Albert Victor claimed that he had been forced into hiding due to threats against his life related to his investigations into certain irregularities in the royal succession. The document alleged that he had discovered evidence of illegitimate claims to the throne dating back several generations, evidence that would have called into question the legitimacy of the entire modern royal line. Even more shocking was the claim that Prince Albert Victor had not died of influenza, but had instead gone into exile under an assumed identity, leaving behind this will as proof of his true fate. The document named specific individuals who had been involved in the conspiracy to remove him from the line of succession, including several prominent members of the aristocracy, and even some within the royal household itself. James read and reread the document, scarcely believing what he was seeing. If this will was authentic, it represented evidence of a conspiracy that had shaped over a century of British history. The implications were staggering. Not only would it call into question the legitimacy of the current royal family, but it would also suggest that one of the most famous deaths in royal history had been entirely fabricated. He carefully examined the other documents in the chest. There were several letters, apparently correspondence between Prince Albert Victor and various individuals, discussing the evidence he claimed to have uncovered. One letter, dated just days before his supposed death, described his plans to flee England and his intention to one day return to reclaim his rightful place on the throne. Another document appeared to be a detailed genealogy, tracing royal bloodlines back several centuries and highlighting what the author claimed were breaks in the legitimate succession. Names and dates were meticulously recorded, creating a family tree that told a very different story from the official royal history. As James continued to study the documents, he became increasingly aware of the magnitude of what he had discovered. These papers, if authentic, didn't just represent a historical curiosity. They were potentially explosive evidence that could shake the very foundation of the British monarchy. The current royal family's claim to the throne could be called into question, and the constitutional crisis that would result could tear apart the nation. But even as he grasped the significance of his discovery, James found himself questioning what he should do next. His oath as a royal guard bound him to protect and serve the crown. But what did that oath mean when faced with evidence that the crown itself might be built on a foundation of lies and conspiracy? He carefully photographed each document with his phone, making sure to capture every detail of the handwriting and any distinguishing marks that might help verify their authenticity. The quality of the parchment, the consistency of the ink, and the style of writing all suggested genuine period documents. But James knew that determining their true authenticity would require expert analysis. As he prepared to leave the hidden chamber, James noticed something else in the bottom of the chest. Wrapped in a separate cloth was a small golden locket, tarnished with age but bearing the distinctive crest of the Duke of Clarence. Inside the locket was a miniature portrait of a woman James didn't recognize, along with a small slip of paper bearing what appeared to be an address in Scotland. The discovery of the locket added another layer of mystery to the already incredible find. Who was the woman in the portrait, and what was the significance of the Scottish address? James made note of both details, sensing that they might be crucial pieces of a puzzle that was far more complex than he had initially realized. By the time he emerged from the hidden passage, the sun had fully risen, and the castle was beginning to stir with the activities of the day's shift. James carefully replaced the loose panel, making sure that no outward sign of his discovery remained visible. He needed time to think, time to decide how to handle what he had found. As he completed his patrol rounds, his mind raced with the implications of his discovery. The weight of the secret he now carried felt almost unbearable. These documents, if revealed, could change everything. But they also placed him in an incredibly dangerous position. Throughout history, people had died to protect secrets far less significant than this. James returned to his quarters, his usual post-patrol routine feeling surreal in light of what he had experienced. He sat at his small desk, staring at the photographs on his phone, still hardly believing what he had discovered. The face of Prince Albert Victor looked back at him from one of the portraits in the documents, a young man whose official death had shaped over a century of royal succession. The questions multiplied in his mind. If Prince Albert Victor had indeed survived and gone into exile, what had become of him? Were there descendants who might have legitimate claims to the throne? And, most importantly, who else knew about these documents? And how far would they go to keep this secret buried? As the day wore on, James found himself unable to concentrate on his normal duties. Every interaction with his colleagues felt loaded with potential danger, every routine conversation seeming to hide deeper meanings. He had always prided himself on his straightforward nature and his clear sense of duty, but now he found himself thrust into a world of secrets and conspiracies that challenged everything he believed about his role and his responsibilities. That evening, alone in his quarters, James began to research the address he had found in the locket. It led to a small village in the Scottish Highlands, not far from Balmoral itself. The coincidence seemed too significant to ignore, and he began to wonder if there might be more to discover about Prince Albert Victor's supposed exile. As night fell over Balmoral, James lay awake staring at the ceiling, knowing that his life had been irrevocably changed by what he had discovered in that hidden chamber. The loyal guard who had begun his patrol that morning was gone, replaced by a man carrying one of the most dangerous secrets in British history. He thought about his oath of service, his dedication to the crown, and his love for the traditions he had spent his career protecting. But he also thought about the truth, and about the responsibility that came with knowledge that could reshape the understanding of an entire nation's history. The documents hidden behind that loose panel had opened a door that could never be closed again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions. James knew that he stood at a crossroads that would define not only his own future, but potentially the future of the British monarchy itself. The question that haunted him as he finally drifted off to sleep was not whether the truth should be revealed, but whether he had the courage to be the one to reveal it. The following days passed in a blur of internal conflict for James MacLeod. The discovery of the hidden documents had transformed his normally straightforward existence into something resembling a spy novel, complete with secrets that could topple governments and conspiracies that stretched back over a century. He found himself analyzing every interaction, every glance from his colleagues, wondering who might know about the hidden chamber and its explosive contents. James had always been a methodical man, a trait that had served him well in his security work. Now, he applied that same careful approach to investigating the authenticity of his discovery. During his off hours, he began researching Prince Albert Victor's life and death, looking for any historical details that might support or contradict the claims made in the documents he had found. The official history was well documented. Prince Albert Victor, known to his family as Eddie, had been born in 1864 as the eldest son of the future King Edward VII. He had been a somewhat controversial figure, rumored to be involved in various scandals, though many historians argued that these rumors were largely unfounded. His death from pneumonia in January 1892, just weeks before he was to marry Princess Mary of Teck, had dramatically altered the line of succession. But, as James delved deeper into historical accounts, he began to notice inconsistencies that he had never paid attention to before. The circumstances surrounding Prince Albert Victor's death had always been somewhat vague. Some accounts suggested he had been ill for weeks, while others claimed his decline had been sudden. The funeral had been conducted with unusual haste, and surprisingly few detailed accounts of his final days had survived. More intriguing still was what James discovered about Prince Albert Victor's personality and interests. Far from being the dissolute young man often portrayed in popular accounts, he had apparently been deeply interested in social reform and had expressed concerns about the growing inequality in British society. Several obscure historical sources suggested that he had been investigating irregularities in land ownership and inheritance laws, particularly as they related to royal properties and titles. James also researched the address he had found in the locket. The village of Strathmore was a small Highland community about 30 miles from Balmoral, known primarily for its whiskey distillery and sheep farming. But when he looked into property records from the 1890s, he discovered something remarkable. A substantial estate near Strathmore had been purchased in late 1891 by a man named Edward Clarence, a name that was suspiciously close to Prince Albert Victor's full name and titles. The more James investigated, the more convinced he became that the documents he had found might indeed be authentic. But authentication would require expert analysis, and that would mean bringing others into his dangerous secret. He knew that the wrong person learning about his discovery could put him in mortal danger. After a week of careful consideration, James decided to approach someone he trusted implicitly. Dr. Margaret Sinclair was a historian specializing in Victorian-era documents who worked part-time as a consultant for the royal household. James had known her for 3 years, and she had always impressed him with her integrity and discretion. More importantly, she had the expertise to analyze the documents properly. James arranged to meet Dr. Sinclair at a small cafe in nearby Ballater, choosing a public place that would seem natural for their conversation. Margaret was a woman in her late 50s, with graying hair and intelligent blue eyes that seemed to see through any deception. She had dedicated her career to uncovering historical truths, regardless of how inconvenient those truths might be for established narratives. "I need your help with something unusual," James began carefully, after they had exchanged pleasantries over coffee. "I've come across some documents that I think you should examine. They relate to Prince Albert Victor." Margaret's eyebrows rose with interest. "Prince Albert Victor? That's a fascinating period. What kind of documents?" James hesitated, knowing that once he spoke, there would be no going back. "Documents that suggest his death might not have happened the way we've been told. Documents that could change everything we know about the royal succession." The historian's expression grew serious. She studied James's face, clearly trying to determine whether he was serious or had perhaps fallen victim to some elaborate hoax. "James, you understand what you're suggesting? Claims like that would need extraordinary evidence to support them." "I know," James replied quietly. "That's why I need someone with your expertise to examine them. Someone who can tell me whether they're authentic or if I've discovered the most elaborate forgery in British history." Margaret agreed to meet with James privately the following evening, at her cottage outside Ballater. The location would provide the privacy they needed for a thorough examination of the documents, away from any potential surveillance or unwanted attention. James spent the intervening day making copies of the digital photographs he had taken, ensuring that the evidence would survive even if something happened to the originals. The next evening, James arrived at Margaret's cottage as the Highland twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. The cottage was exactly what he had expected, filled with books, historical artifacts, and the tools of serious scholarship. Margaret had prepared her study for their meeting, with proper lighting and magnification equipment that would allow her to examine every detail of the document photographs. "Before we begin," Margaret said, pouring tea for both of them, "I want you to understand the potential implications of what you're showing me. If these documents are authentic, they don't just represent a historical curiosity. They would be evidence of what might be the greatest cover-up in British political history." James nodded grimly. "I've been thinking about nothing else for the past week. But I need to know the truth, whatever it might be." Margaret began her examination with the methodical thoroughness that James had expected. She studied the photographs of the handwriting under magnification, comparing them to verified samples of Prince Albert Victor's hand that she had in her reference materials. She analyzed the paper, the ink, and the style of language used in the documents. After 2 hours of careful examination, Margaret sat back in her chair, her face pale with the implications of what she had discovered. "James," she said quietly, "I can't be absolutely certain without physical examination of the original documents, but everything I see here suggests authenticity. The handwriting is consistent with verified samples of Prince Albert Victor's hand. The paper and ink appear to be period appropriate. The language and phrasing are exactly what I would expect from an educated young man of that era." James felt his stomach drop. Part of him had hoped that the documents would prove to be elaborate fakes, relieving him of the burden of carrying such a dangerous secret. But Margaret's expertise was confirming his worst fears. "There's something else," Margaret continued, pulling out a thick reference book. "I've been researching Prince Albert Victor for years as part of a broader study of Victorian royal correspondence. There have always been gaps in the historical records surrounding his death, inconsistencies that have puzzled historians. These documents would explain many of those inconsistencies." She opened the book to a page showing a family tree of the royal lineage. "Look at this carefully. If Prince Albert Victor survived and went into exile, it would mean that the entire subsequent royal succession was based on a false premise. His younger brother George became King George V only because Albert Victor was presumed dead. Every monarch since then, including the current royal family, would have been ruling without legitimate claim." The weight of this revelation settled over James like a physical burden. "What you're saying is that these documents don't just reveal a historical secret. They potentially invalidate over a century of British monarchy." "Exactly," Margaret confirmed. "And that makes them incredibly dangerous. There would be people who would kill to keep this secret buried, and others who would kill to expose it. You're holding evidence that could trigger a constitutional crisis unlike anything Britain has ever seen." They spent the next several hours discussing the implications of the discovery. Margaret explained the complex legal and constitutional issues that would arise if the documents were made public. The question of royal succession was governed by centuries of law and precedent, but at its heart was the principle of legitimate inheritance. If that legitimacy could be called into question, the entire foundation of the monarchy could crumble. "There's something else we need to consider," Margaret said, examining the photograph of the locket and the Scottish address. "If Prince Albert Victor did survive and go into exile, there might be descendants. People who would have legitimate claims to the throne that supersede the current royal family." James had been thinking the same thing. The address in Strathmore could potentially lead to living people whose very existence would represent an existential threat to the current monarchy. The implications were staggering. "What do you think we should do?" James asked, though he dreaded the answer. Margaret was quiet for a long time, staring at the photographs spread across her desk. "As a historian, I believe the truth should always be revealed, regardless of the consequences. But as someone who understands the potential ramifications of this particular truth, I'm terrified of what might happen if these documents become public knowledge." She turned to look at James directly. "The decision has to be yours. You're the one who discovered them. And you're the one who will bear the consequences of whatever choice you make. But I will say this. If you decide to pursue this further, you need to be extremely careful. There are powerful people who would view these documents as an existential threat. James left Margaret's cottage that night with his mind reeling from the confirmation of his worst fears. The documents were almost certainly authentic, which meant that he was carrying one of the most dangerous secrets in modern history. The choice before him was clear, but terrifying. Remain silent and allow the secret to stay buried, or pursue the truth regardless of the personal cost. Over the next few days, James found himself unable to concentrate on his normal duties. Every routine patrol felt surreal, knowing that he was protecting a royal estate while simultaneously harboring evidence that could destroy the very institution he had sworn to serve. He caught himself studying his colleagues, wondering if any of them might be involved in maintaining the secret, or if any of them might be trusted with the truth. The weight of the secret was becoming unbearable, but James knew that once he took the next step, there would be no turning back. The address in Strathmore beckoned to him like a siren call, promising answers, but also threatening to drag him into depths from which he might never return. As he lay awake night after night, staring at the ceiling of his quarters, James wrestled with the fundamental question that would define the rest of his life. Was his duty to protect the crown as it existed, or to protect the truth about what the crown should rightfully be? The loyal guard who had discovered the hidden chamber was rapidly evolving into something else entirely. James MacLeod was becoming a man carrying the power to reshape British history, and the responsibility that came with that power was threatening to crush him under its weight. The decision he would make in the coming days would echo through generations, affecting not just his own life, but potentially the lives of millions of people who looked to the monarchy as a symbol of stability and continuity. The irony was not lost on him that in his quest to protect the crown, he might be forced to destroy it. 2 weeks after his meeting with Dr. Margaret Sinclair, James MacLeod found himself standing at a crossroads that would define the remainder of his life. The weight of carrying such an explosive secret had begun to affect every aspect of his existence. His sleep was fitful, filled with dreams of hidden passages and ancient conspiracies. His appetite had diminished, and his colleagues had begun to notice his distracted behavior during routine duties. The breaking point came on a gray Thursday morning when James realized he could no longer function normally while carrying the burden alone. The address in Strathmore had become an obsession, a piece of the puzzle that demanded investigation regardless of the personal cost. He knew that visiting the location would represent crossing a line from passive discovery to active investigation. But the alternative was slowly going mad from the weight of unanswered questions. James arranged for a long weekend leave, citing personal family matters that required his attention in the Scottish Highlands. His supervisor granted the request without question, as James had always been a reliable employee who rarely requested time off. The irony that he was using his exemplary service record to potentially undermine the institution he served was not lost on him. On Friday morning, James set out for Strathmore in his personal vehicle, a weathered Land Rover that was well suited for Highland travel. The journey would take him through some of Scotland's most beautiful countryside, but he was too preoccupied with the magnitude of his mission to appreciate the scenery. Every mile that carried him closer to his destination felt like another step into a conspiracy that had remained hidden for over a century. The village of Strathmore was exactly as James had imagined it, a small Highland community that seemed untouched by the modern world. Stone cottages with slate roofs lined the main street, and sheep grazed in fields that stretched toward mountains shrouded in mist. The local pub, the Highland Crown, served as the social center of the community, and James decided it would be the logical place to begin his investigation. The pub was warm and welcoming, with dark wooden beams and walls decorated with local hunting trophies and clan tartans. The proprietor, a large man named Duncan Mackenzie, greeted James with the natural friendliness of Highland hospitality. After ordering a pint and a simple meal, James began to carefully probe for information about the local area and its history. "I'm interested in the old estates around here," James said casually, making conversation with Duncan. "I understand there are some interesting historical properties in the area." Duncan's eyes lit up with interest. Aye, there are indeed. Are you perhaps thinking of buying property, or are you more of a historian? A bit of both, James replied truthfully. I'm particularly interested in anything dating back to the 1890s. I've heard there was an estate purchased around that time by someone named Edward Clarence. The change in Duncan's expression was subtle but unmistakable. A shadow seemed to cross his face, and he glanced around the pub as if checking who might be listening. Edward Clarence, he repeated quietly. Now that's a name I haven't heard mentioned in quite some time. James felt his pulse quicken. The reaction suggested that Duncan knew something about the mysterious Edward Clarence, but was reluctant to discuss it openly. Is the estate still there? I'd be interested in seeing it, even if it's not for sale. Duncan was quiet for a moment, apparently weighing his words carefully. The Clarence estate is still there, though it's been complicated for many years. The ownership has never been entirely clear, and there have been legal disputes about it for decades. Most locals prefer not to get involved in the matter. This response only heightened James's interest. Legal disputes over ownership suggested that someone had been challenging claims to the property, possibly descendants of the original Edward Clarence. Would it be possible to see the estate, even from a distance? I'm quite interested in Victorian architecture. Duncan studied James carefully, as if trying to determine his true motivations. I suppose there would be no harm in that. The estate is about 5 miles out of the village, up the Glen Road. You can't miss it. It's the only substantial house in that direction. But I'd advise you not to approach the house itself. The current caretakers are not welcoming to strangers. James thanked Duncan for the information and finished his meal, his mind racing with the implications of what he had learned. The existence of current caretakers suggested that the estate was not abandoned, and the mysterious legal disputes hinted at ongoing conflicts over inheritance that could be connected to his discovery at Balmoral. After leaving the pub, James drove up the Glen Road that Duncan had described. The landscape became increasingly wild and remote as he traveled away from the village, with heather-covered hills rising on either side of the narrow track. After about 20 minutes of driving, he crested a small rise and saw the estate spread out in the valley below. The house was a substantial Victorian manor, built in the Scottish baronial style with turrets and elaborate stonework that spoke of considerable wealth and ambition. Even from a distance, James could see that the property had been well maintained, with manicured gardens and what appeared to be recently repaired roofing. This was not an abandoned estate, but a functioning residence that someone was investing significant resources to preserve. James parked his Land Rover in a concealed spot among some trees and used binoculars to observe the estate more closely. The house was clearly occupied. He could see smoke rising from several chimneys and movement in some of the windows. What struck him most forcefully was the architectural style, which was remarkably similar to portions of Balmoral Castle. It was as if someone had tried to recreate the royal aesthetic in this remote Highland valley. As he watched, a figure emerged from the house and began walking toward what appeared to be a garden at the rear of the property. Even at a distance, James could see that it was an elderly man, walking with the aid of a cane, but moving with obvious purpose and dignity. Something about the man's bearing reminded James of the formal deportment he associated with royal training and aristocratic education. James spent several hours observing the estate, taking careful photographs and notes about what he could see. The property was clearly substantial, with extensive grounds that included formal gardens, what appeared to be a small chapel, and several outbuildings that suggested a self-sufficient operation. Most importantly, it was obvious that considerable money had been spent maintaining the estate over many decades, suggesting a continuous line of ownership and inheritance. As the afternoon wore on, James noticed increased activity around the house. Several vehicles arrived, and people in formal attire began gathering in what appeared to be a ceremony or important meeting. Through his binoculars, James could see that the participants were well-dressed and seemed to be treating the occasion with considerable solemnity. The gathering reminded James of the formal procedures he had observed during royal functions at Balmoral. There was the same attention to protocol, the same careful arrangement of participants according to apparent rank or importance. Whatever was happening at the Clarence estate, it was being conducted with the kind of formality that suggested deep traditions and established hierarchies. As evening approached, James realized that he needed to retreat before his presence was discovered. But he had seen enough to confirm his growing suspicion that the estate was connected to his discovery at Balmoral. The architectural similarities, the obvious wealth and continuity, and the formal behavior of the residents all suggested connections to royal traditions that should not have existed in this remote location. James returned to the village and checked into the small bed-and breakfast that served the occasional tourist who ventured into this corner of the Highlands. The proprietor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Campbell, was friendly but seemed surprised that anyone would choose to visit Strathmore during the off-season. "Not many visitors this time of year," she commented as she showed James to his room. "Most folks prefer the summer months when the weather is more agreeable. Are you here on business, or just exploring the area?" "I'm interested in local history," James replied, maintaining his cover story. "I've heard there are some interesting old estates in the area." Mrs. Campbell's expression became guarded, much as Duncan's had at the pub. "There are indeed some old properties, though most folks prefer not to discuss them. There have been complications over the years, and it's generally considered best to let sleeping dogs lie." The repeated reluctance to discuss the estate was becoming a pattern that suggested the local community was aware of secrets they preferred not to reveal. James wondered how many generations of Strathmore residents had been keeping quiet about whatever was happening at the Clarence estate. That evening, James sat in his small room and reviewed the photographs and notes he had made during his surveillance of the estate. The evidence was beginning to form a picture that both excited and terrified him. If Prince Albert Victor had indeed survived his supposed death and established himself in this remote Highland location, then the estate he had observed might be home to his descendants. The implications were staggering. If there were living descendants of Prince Albert Victor who had legitimate claims to the throne, then their very existence represented a constitutional crisis that could destroy the current monarchy. The careful maintenance of the estate, the obvious wealth of its inhabitants, and the formal protocols he had observed suggested that these potential heirs were not only aware of their heritage but were actively maintaining the traditions and preparations that would be necessary for an eventual claim to the throne. James realized that he was no longer simply investigating a historical mystery. He was potentially observing the headquarters of an alternative royal family, one that had been waiting for over a century for the opportunity to reclaim what they believed was their rightful inheritance. The weight of this possibility kept James awake for most of the night. He understood that his next decision would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the fate of the British nation. Should he retreat now and try to forget what he had discovered? Should he report his findings to his superiors and let them decide how to handle the situation? Or should he pursue the investigation further, knowing that each step deeper into the conspiracy made him a greater threat to powerful people who had spent generations protecting their secrets? By morning, James had made his decision.